Marxism and the Existential Problems of Man by Milan Prucha. Milan Prucha of the Institute of Philosophy, the Prague Academy of Sciences, has taught at the State University in Moscow and studied in France. He has published several essays in his field of interest, the critical analysis of phenomenology and existentialism, including philosophical problems of the existence of man, and cogito and prima philosophia in Marxism. He was born in Plzeň, Czechoslovakia in 1931. Existentialism, Marxism, and Christian philosophy conflict over the concept of alienation. Is man thrust into an absurd world in which the facts of mortality condemns all his aspirations? Is man an unrepeatable product of the historical process, revolting against exploitation and against the alienated machinery of social organization? Are the problems of life and death independent of social organization, or are they exclusively historical problems which will find their final solution in the harmony between the individual and society? Although existentialists and Christians radically oppose each other, they are agreed in their interpretation of Marx. Hegel conceived alienation in the following manner. The subject first encounters the outer, to him alien world, but later recognizes himself in this object, thus reassuring himself of the identity of consciousness and being. Marx, it is said, comprehends alienation, that is, the fact that man's creations become blind and hostile forces to him, as a manifestation of transitory capitalist relations, rather than deducing it from the existence of the objective world. From this interpretation, it is easy for Marx's critics to object that any social or human relationship will always end in externalization, that technology, the means by which man forms his world, or state administration, even a socialist one, becomes alienated, that love or any human relationship results in separation or the realization of oneself outside oneself. This criticism is extended to a broader problem. Marxism encloses man within history so that it is unable to confront man with the external world and thus can deal only with historical, not existential problems. The description of the difference between Marx's and Hegel's conception of alienation is an oversimplification. Marx criticized Hegel on the ground that he could not comprehend the specificity of the alienation of social relations in capitalist society. But he also criticized him on the most general philosophical level. Quote, when Hegel conceives wealth, the power of the state, etc., as entities alienated from the human being, Hegel conceives them only in their thought form. They are entities of thought and thus simply an alienation of pure, i.e. abstract, philosophical thought. Alienation is the opposition within thought itself. End quote. Marx, Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts. A critical examination of Marx's economic and philosophic manuscripts shows that for Marx, as well as for Hegel, labor, in its most general form, always presupposes alienation and the overcoming of alienation. But this general analysis of labor is not identical with the concept of alienated labor that Marx later formulated in his critical study of capitalist society. In Grundrisse and in Capital, Marx speaks of reified relations and reification. He uses these concepts to express the alien character and the alienation of capitalist relations of production. Quote, "The social character of activity appears here as an alien object in relation to the individuals. Their mutual relationship appears to the individuals themselves as something alien and autonomous, as an object." End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Thus, Marx did not reduce Hegel's complex conception to an analysis of man's position in history or to an analysis of the economic relations between men. Hegel limited alienation to the realm of thought and reduced the human drama to a spiritual drama. But Marx had a total conception of man, which included man's relations to the outside world. In order to compare Marx's viewpoint with that of existentialism and Christianity, it is not enough to analyze the terminology. A thorough understanding of the concept of alienation in terms of philosophical materialism and atheism is necessary. In Heidegger's conception of the world, in Heidegger's conception, there should be a comma there. It's not my fault. Should have been a comma. In Heidegger's conception, the world is deprived of its independent qualities and meanings and possesses only those which it acquires through its contact with human subjectivity. There are no ideas in Sein und Zeit capable of expressing the resistance with matter, which matter offers to man. There is no ideas in, what the hell is that book? Being in Time? Sein und Zeit. There are no ideas in Being in Time capable of expressing the resistance which matter offers to man. The intriguing formula which proclaims man as a being thrust into a world alien to him, and which calls for mediation on this tragic aspect of human life, turns out to be a disappointment. The extreme sharpening of the contradiction between being and consciousness in Sartre's philosophy results in the disappearance of contradictions between man and the world, because their mutual alienation becomes so absolute and that subjective choices are detached from the material conditions within which they are possible. Existential philosophy, which meant to express the tragedy of man's situation, becomes a superficial optimism through its idealism. Man is not the universal purpose of the world, which man is not the universal purpose of the world, which religious illusion believes him to be. Man came into existence in a certain part of the universe, under certain favorable conditions, as a partial product of the development of matter. Man must therefore assert himself through his practical activity against the world as a whole. Quote, "Rooted in the world, he must carry into it a meaning given by human existential needs." The materialistic conception of the world, expressing the, quote, "relatedness" and, quote, "alienation" of man and the world, overcomes the one-sidedness of existential and Christian philosophy, and forms the basis for solving the philosophical problems of man's existence. There is neither absolute alienation, which prevents communication between man and the world, nor total harmony, which presupposes the possibility of identifying man with the world. The world cannot be a pure object to man, nor can the world be pure Erlebnis. And no one knows what the fuck that means. Get out of here. The world is not a pure object, because man must already be in the world, must live in reality, in order to make reality his object. Reality, however, cannot be a mere Erlebnis, because man can only live in the world by making the world the object of his knowledge and of his transforming activity. In our opinion, this is the significance of Marx's criticism of all previous materialist philosophies. They did not comprehend that, quote, things, reality, the sensible world are conceived only in the form of objects of contemplation, but not as human sense activity, as practice, not subjectively, end quote. The first thesis on Feuerbach. Philosophy after Marx cannot ask simply whether the world stands before man or against man in the form of an object. The perspective on problems of human existence has fundamentally changed, and the inquiry has to be concerned with how man lives in the world. Mechanical materialism conceived man as a thing among things, as a machine, but it was not capable of erecting a spiritual dam against idealism. As a philosophy for which reality exists only in the form of an object, mechanical materialism unconsciously replaced as a philosophy for which reality exists only in the form of an object, mechanical materialism unconsciously placed the philosophizing ego before the reality from which the ego observed and judged it. Thus, mechanical materialism transformed the real ego into a derealized and unreal ego, into pure self-consciousness. Reality degenerated into dead matter, incompatible with any kind of subjectivity. Marx surpassed this concept of man by overcoming its naturalism and applying socio-historical criteria. But he also changed the entire perspective of philosophy. It ceased to be a philosophy of being prior to reality, a philosophy of contemplation, and became a philosophy leading to intellectual clarification of the position of the ego in the known reality, and of the act by which the ego makes reality its object. The concept of ego and reality are not abstractions, as in Hegel. The concepts relate both to a material, natural being and to nature. That is why Marx emphasizes that if real physical man posits his objective being and powers as alien objects, quote, the positing is not the subject. The positing is the subjectivity of objective powers, end quote. Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts. Man is a subject in that man exists in his natural forces, and as his natural forces and the only possible object of his life's manifestations are real sensuous objects. The being which has no object outside itself is not objective. The being which does not have its own naturalness outside itself is not natural because it is not part of nature's essence. Objective being has objects outside itself and is an object. The objective being behaves objectively, and its being is thus an objective being. The natural being is a finite, conditioned, limited, suffering being because the objects in which it confirms itself are independent of it. Hunger, for instance, is an objective bodily need, a need for an external object. Quote, man as an objective sentient being is a suffering being, and since he feels his suffering, a passionate being. Passion is man's faculties striving to attain their object. End quote. Marx. Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts. Marx's analysis of man as a material, objective, suffering, and passionate being stands as irrefutable proof of the superficiality of those critics who accuse Marx of reducing all human problems to that of man's condition in capitalist society. The merits of the philosophical concept of man as an objective being are vindicated in the controversy between Marxism and existentialism. Heidegger, for instance, was incapable of dealing with the problem of existence in terms of the corporeality of the existing being. The latter, the corporeality of the existing being for him, as it is for Hegel, pure subjectivity, moving in a world of pure, For Heidegger, for instance, was incapable of dealing with the problem of existence in terms of the corporeality of the existing being. The latter is for him, as it is for Hegel, pure subjectivity moving in a world of pure thought. Sartre formulates this problem only as an antinomy. I am my body because self-consciousness is possible only as consciousness of a certain facticity. At the same time, I am not my body because the body is exceeded by what I am. In his conception of unconditioned and unmotivated freedom, however, he retreats even from these controversial positions. Here man assumes the form of pure ego, of thought, of self-consciousness. He is completely excluded from reality. Nothing conditions or determines him. The inability to conceive man as an objective being and place him in the real world results in a conception of existence based on the mutual alienation of the ego and the world. Hence the emptiness of ego, which is the abstract negation of the world and all of the world's wealth. Hence the characterization of man's being as a quote, being for death, end quote, as a center of feelings of anxiety, disgust, boredom. No doubt credit must be given to existentialism for reopening the problem of death in its deep philosophical meaning. A problem which appears with brutal radicalism in every atheistic philosophy. Existentialists have convincingly shown that death means that chance and absurdity are ineradicable. Existentialists have convincingly shown that death means that chance and absurdity are ineradicable constituent elements of human existence. Does this mean, however, that mortality is the sole or determining factor of man's existence? Does death devalue all human aspirations, all human desires, relationships, and feelings? The empty ego of the subjectivistic concept of man can have in fact no other problem but that of its bare existence. But if man is conceived as an object, if man is conceived as an objective being, he ceases to move only within the abstract sphere of yes or no, and he becomes a being completely interested in the world. Just to preserve existence is not his sole interest. As an objective being, he is universally passionate and craves the world. He experiences hunger, sex, and the whole vast range of specifically human passions and feelings, not merely anxiety. The finitude of the objective being is thus not reduced to its mortality. It must of the necessity. The finitude of the objective being is thus not reduced to its mortality. The finitude of the objective being is thus not reduced to its mortality. It must of necessity realize itself outside itself in the objective world. This finitude is the exact opposite of the indifference to man. This finitude is the exact opposite of the indifference to which, according to Heidegger, the comprehension of man as mortal must lead. Man is far freer than existentialism would have him. Through his interest in the world and in the fate of other people, he creates his human riches, and the hierarchy of interest and values which deprive death of its character of the absolute arbiter. Quote, positive passions confirm the structure of human existence and are just as, quote, authentic as anxiety, boredom, or disgust. The natural structure of man as a finite being is thus the complete openness of the world. An interest in the world and not abstract negativity, death. A more complex view of the problems of man's existence may be outlined on the basis of Marx's philosophy. In criticism of some oversimplified interpretations of Marx, reveals the true meaning of the social determination of man. The common denominator of the various philosophical concepts opposed by Marxism is the traditional view that the individual precedes society, which is expressed in such notions as the, quote, social contract. The traditional view attempts to derive the social structure from the qualities of the individual. Human essence is seen as an abstraction, common to each single individual, so that the methods for studying it consist in finding characteristics common to all individuals. The logic of this conception leads to a type of conclusion which may be illustrated as follows. Because neither Mozart nor Aristotle was engaged in tool production, this activity does not belong to the human essence, but the soft earlap, which is found only in man and not in other animals, does belong. Thus conceived, history is only an external and accidental sideshow, manifesting an unchangeable human essence given by God or by nature, which must then be identified with human nature. The naturalistic interpretation of man operates deliberately with the method of an impoverishing reductionism. It cannot find within the sphere of natural qualities an equivalent to the results of manifold human activity, and therefore explains all this wealth by means of a few instincts. It cannot comprehend the freedom of human existence, and therefore opposes to it a physiological or other primitive determinism. Marx comprehends the essence of man as the result of specific human activity, in accordance with his concept of practical materialism. Man as a natural being creates social reality. This is a new reality in comparison with natural reality, in which the being of each individual achieves its content only in relation to other individuals, in relation to the social entity. In the sixth thesis on Feuerbach, Marx wrote, "The essence of man is not an abstraction inherent in each individual. In its reality, it is the totality of social relations. In the sixth thesis on Feuerbach, Marx wrote, "The essence of man is not an abstraction inherent in each individual. In its reality, it is the totality of social relations." Sorry, I'm going to reread that one more time. In the sixth thesis on Feuerbach, Marx wrote, "The essence of man is not an abstraction inherent in each individual. In its reality, it is the totality of social relations." End quote. Quote, "Sociability, as a determinant of the essence of man, cannot be understood as a characteristic of the abstract individual, but as a reference to social reality. In the dynamics of social reality, which are more varied than the activity of each individual. The data of an answer to the question, what is man, are being historically formed and concretized. In this way, it is possible to approach more concretely the study of human existence and to follow the actual historical process of Jesus Christ. In this way, it is possible to approach more concretely the study of human essence and to follow the actual historical process of its formation. The relevant questions concern the degree to which man has cultivated the variety of his social relations, the extent to which man has extricated himself from nature and developed his social essence, and the degree to which his individual existence has become a social one. Man's existence at the same time contains irreducible natural determinations which may be modified in various ways in history, but not abolished. Human naturalness, which Marx describes in these words, quote, "My own nature, which is a unity of needs and impulses," end quote, Grundrisse, is not identical with human essence. This is a necessary notion in the Marxist comprehension of man, which Marx uses both in his early works and in the Grundrisse and in Capital. It enables him to judge the mode of social existence in order to determine whether human naturalness confirms itself in it and develops or is mutilated. It is also necessary to examine the relationship of individual existence and the social essence of man to see a. whether individual existence appears as an affirmation of the social essence or as the social essence's negation, and b. whether the social essence manifests itself to individuals as their own potency or as an uncontrollable force which subjugates and overwhelms them. Marxism, because it differentiates between existence of man and his social existence, differs profoundly from existentialism. Marxism, because it differentiates between the existence of man and his social essence, differs profoundly from existentialism. According to Sartre, the human individual has no essence. I shall have an essence only after I am dead. Heidegger pays lip service to the essence of man. Quote, "The essence of being is in its existence," end quote. Sein und Zeit, being in time. But for Heidegger, as for other existentialists, the essence of man is identical with human existence, which is conceived wholly uncritically in its bare immediacy outside of history and other external determinants. The conception of existence is, on the intellectual level, a continuation of Kierkegaard's protest against a purely speculative overcoming of the individual's suffering in Hegel's system of philosophical abstractions. Existentialists passionately try to proclaim that human existence cannot be reduced to an idea, but they completely miss the mark as far as the Marxist conception of the relation between human existence and essence is concerned. In Marxist philosophy, the human essence is not merely an ideal, a norm, a product of the intellect, but is a product of history. Marxism does not reduce the existence of man to its social essence, but it avoids an uncritical acceptance of the given existence. Unlike Hegel, who emphasizes essence, and unlike existentialism, which emphasizes existence, Marxism does not identify existence with essence. By a critical, concrete, historical confrontation of man's existence with his social essence, Marxism asserts itself as a philosophy of active humanism. If we regard communism as the movement which forms itself in history, as an answer to the question of the relationship between existence and essence, this is in accord with the views formulated by Marx as early as the economic and philosophical manuscripts. Communism is, quote, the true solution of the conflict between existence and essence, end quote. Quote, the real appropriation of human essence through and for man, end quote. Quote, the whole movement of history is his act of creation, end quote. And quote, communism is humanism, a complete humanism, end quote. It is not a question of opposing these ideas to Marx's later studies, but of avoiding the distortion of the humanist core of Marx's concept of communism, which a preoccupation with the latter writings may produce. Sorry, let me say that again because I blanked out. I'm not even listening to myself. Why would anyone else listen to me? It is not a question of opposing these ideas to Marx's later studies, but of avoiding the distortion of the humanist core of Marx's concept of communism, which a preoccupation with the later writings may produce. The dynamics of history cannot be deduced from individual existence. The concept of total man expresses much more than the most general existential structures. It is a concept which cannot be determined speculatively because it formulates a historically arising perspective of the development of man. Human existence is not excluded from history and does not human existence is not excluded from history and does not contain a dynamic not deducible from history. The question of the forms and modes of individual existence is thus a historical question. Marx refuted the sophistry of bourgeois philosophers and economists who presented capitalist social relations as the expression of the natural traits of individuals. To attempt to deduce the notion of total man from general existential structures would be to make the same mistake. Quote, the universally developed individuals whose social relations are brought under their own control as their own communal interrelationship are the products not of nature but of history. The level and the universality of the development of wealth, which makes this individuality possible, itself depends upon production on the basis of exchange value. End quote. Grundrisse. This does not mean that the concept of total man is wholly outside the existential problem. It constitutes a concrete historical solution, although it does not abolish these problems. The existential structure of man as an object, the existential structure of man as an objective being, and as a being whose essence is not inherent in the abstract individual, but is of a social nature, has always determined the most general features of the mode of man's self-assertion. It has always been and will always be possible solely as an assertion of his essential powers, as an active and passionate relation of this finite being to the world, and as the acquisition and development of the possibilities and values that society imparts to the individual. The self-assertion of man occurs in an alienated form for a long period. The active being of the individual is suffering because it is exploited in exhausting and deadening work. His social being is alienated and thus transformed into an uncontrollable power which opposes him and reduces him to a slave. The conception of total man expresses a perspective through which to overcome this alienation. By abolishing exploitation, by subjecting the entire social process to the control of associated individuals, by overcoming the division of labor, through deliverance from the pressure of unsatisfied natural needs, through the development of scientific knowledge, by making art a living form, by the creation of a new type of social relationship, etc., the individual can gain new possibilities for liberating himself from his egocentric self-isolation and for participating in the being of all mankind. If under alienated relations, man's essence as a social being has been only a means for his existence, now the existence of man is, in his universal, conscious, and active being, a human social essence. Translated by Tom Bottomore.